Hello Grand Archive players. Let's answer a rules question. How does Palvor Sword work? First, let's look at what this onEnter trigger does. Like any targeted trigger, it targets when it goes onto the stack. In this case, it targets a player. Like any trigger, it can be responded to if either player would like to change what's in the targeted player's graveyard beforehand. Then, when the trigger resolves, it banishes the cards in that player's graveyard face down. Note that, as a triggered ability, it only happens once, affecting only the cards in that graveyard at the time the trigger resolves. It will not affect any cards that enter that graveyard past that point. Also, when the effect banishes the cards, they are turned face down. It may help to think of this movement as cards leaving the graveyard face up and entering banishment face down. I've covered the topic of face down cards a bit in previous videos, such as the ones about Orb of Sealing and Astarte. But to be brief, characteristics of face down cards are unable to be read by the game for any effects that care about those characteristics. For example, face down cards don't have elements, names, type lines, etc. Effects that count or target cards that have any of these specific characteristics will not work on cards that are face down. As for the actual functioning of Palvor Sword's trigger, it is actually the first card in Grand Archive with this specific templating, which has some rules ramifications. Palvor Sword's trigger banishes the cards with the end duration of that effect being when the sword leaves the field. The effect of banishing the cards from and returning the cards to the chosen graveyard is controlled by a singular onEnter trigger with the specified duration. Compared to cards with similar effects such as Orb of Sealing and Enchanting Filigree, returning the cards to their normal state is not controlled by a separate on-leaf trigger. Even compared to cards such as Chilling Touch and the Suppress mechanic, it is neither controlled by a delayed trigger. It is not even dependent on state-based checks. The cards are returned to their owner's graveyard immediately upon Palvor Sword leaving the field. If Palvor Sword is removed from the field in response to its trigger, you might wonder what happens when that trigger resolves. It says to banish the cards in the chosen graveyard until Palvor Sword leaves the field, but it has already left the field. In this case, nothing will happen. The cards in the graveyard are not considered to have moved at all, and any effects that would have triggered upon that happening will not trigger. Note the difference between this interaction and that of cards with on-leaf triggers like Entrancing Filigree or Uther Illustrious King. I've covered this particular interaction in a previous video. Note that when Palvor Sword refers to its own name, it is referring to itself, this object. The banished cards will return when the object that was the origin of the trigger leaves the field, even if its name changes or even if it loses that ability. The onEnter trigger is independent of all of those factors, and cares only about whether the specified object is on the field or not. Also, even if another object named Palvor Sword entered the field by being played or as a copy, Palvor Sword's effect refers only to itself. Another sword would banish cards by its own trigger, but these sets of banished cards are tracked separately. Even though there is another object called Palvor Sword on the field, each Palvor Sword's trigger refers only to the cards that were banished by that trigger. This is different than a card such as Orb of Sealing, whose effect is not tied to the object Orb of Sealing, but rather affects cards with sealing counters on them. Let's take a closer look at Palvor Sword by looking at some examples. Don't worry if they are confusing, these will be relatively complicated. Question. Player A controls a poisonous apple with an Idle Thoughts in their graveyard. Palvor Sword enters the field and banishes that card face down. Does player A take damage? After Idle Thoughts becomes banished face down, the game cannot see that it has floating memory. However, the trigger condition for Poisonous Apple and similar cards, like Nico Whiplash Allure, is for a card with floating memory to move from the graveyard to banishment. That is, it checks whether or not the card has floating memory while it is leaving the graveyard. Therefore, player A will take damage from the Poisonous Apple. Question. There is a Palvor Sword on the field. It becomes fracturized. What happens to the banished cards? The original onEnter trigger of Palvor Sword sets the expiration of its effect as when this object leaves the field. This is a trigger that's already resolved and is not tied to an ability of the Palvor Sword object itself, so nothing happens if Palvor Sword loses its abilities or changes types. The banished cards will return if the fractal leaves the field. Follow-up question. A Palvor Sword enters play and a player fracturizes it in response to the onEnter trigger. What happens? Answer is nothing out of the ordinary. Just like the previous case, the onEnter trigger will resolve as normal and the banished cards will return when the fracturized object leaves the field. This is because triggers are independent of their source, in the sense that triggers in general don't care if their source loses its abilities. This statement might be a bit confusing because in this particular case, the trigger does care about the Palvor Sword object because of the nature of its effect. This specific trigger tracks something about the status of the Palvor Sword that caused it, but only whether or not that object is on the field. Besides that, the state of the object is otherwise irrelevant for the trigger effect. Question. Player B has no water cards in their graveyard, but does have 3 water cards banished by Player A's Palvor Sword. Player A attacks Player B's Dynasty Chancellor with the Palvor Sword with 1 durability, killing it while breaking the sword. Does Player B draw a card? After combat damage is dealt, state-based checks will be performed in the end of combat step. This will cause the game to do 2 things. There is a weapon with no durability that needs to be destroyed, and a lethally damaged ally that needs to be destroyed. The game will perform these actions simultaneously. When this happens, Player B's banished cards will immediately return to their graveyard. Then Dynasty Chancellor's on-death ability will be put onto the stack. When this trigger goes to resolve, it will see that Player B meets the deluge requirement and they will draw a card. By the way, this would also work if Dynasty Chancellor was the 3rd water card in their graveyard. Question. Player A has a Palvor Sword with 1 durability that has banished their own graveyard, which had floating memory in it. They attack Player B's champion with a prepared condemning evisceration along with the sword. Can they deal the extra damage with the evisceration's effect? Similarly to the previous example, when combat damage is dealt, the subsequent state-based checks will destroy the Palvor Sword and put the evisceration's on-hit trigger onto the stack. At this time, the banished cards have already returned to Player A's graveyard, so they will be able to banish a card with floating memory to the evisceration trigger if they want. Question. Player A controls a Palvor Sword with 1 durability that has banished 4 water cards from Player B's graveyard. Player B controls a Horned Knight, which is an animal, and a
Plage au homard.
Player A attacks the Horned Knight with the Palvor Sword. Does Horned Knight survive? When state-based checks are performed after damage is dealt, the game will register that Palvor Sword should be destroyed, and that Horned Knight has been dealt lethal damage and should be destroyed. As soon as this happens, the banished cards will immediately return to Player B's graveyard, and Plage's static effect will immediately begin to apply. All of this will happen before any player gets opportunity, and before any further state-based checks. Unfortunately, it's still just a little too late for Horned Knight, which has already been put into the graveyard. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching.